Volume 2, Chapter 8 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Or if you do not have a book divided into volumes, this is Chapter 31. Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners were very much admired at the parsonage, and the ladies all felt that he must add considerably to the pleasure of their engagements at Rosings. It was some days, however, before they received any invitation thither, for while there were visitors in the house, they could not be necessary. So they were not, the Collins party, they were not invited to Rosings as often as they were before Darcy got there because, well, Lady Catherine has guests and she doesn't need them right now. It was not till Easter Day, almost a week after the gentleman's arrival, that they were honored by such an attention, and then they were merely asked on leaving church to come there in the evening. For the last week they had seen very little of either Lady Catherine or her daughter. Colonel Fitzwilliam had called at the parsonage more than once during the time, but Mr. Darcy they had only seen at church. So Darcy's cousin did go visit them at Charlotte's house, but Darcy didn't. But still, I mean, she's visiting, right? The invitation was accepted, of course, and at a proper hour they joined the party in Lady Catherine's drawing room. Her ladyship received them civilly, but it was plain that their company was by no means so acceptable as when she could get nobody else. And she was, in fact, almost engrossed by her nephew, speaking to them, especially to Darcy, much more than to any other person in the room. Colonel Fitzwilliam seemed really glad to see them. Anything was a welcome relief to him at Rosings, and Mrs. Collins, a pretty friend, had moreover caught his fancy very much. Oh, so Colonel Fitzwilliam is like, oh, this girl's kind of pretty, talking about Elizabeth. He now seated himself by her, and talked so agreeably of Kent and Hertfordshire, of travelling and staying at home, of new books and music, that Elizabeth had never been half so well entertained in that room before. So they're just having a really good conversation, right? And they conversed with so much spirit and flow as to draw the attention of Lady Catherine herself, as well as of Mr. Darcy. His eyes had been soon and repeatedly turned towards them with a look of curiosity. Oh, Mr. Darcy, what are you curious about? And that her ladyship after a while shared the feeling was more openly acknowledged, for she did not scruple to call out, "What is that you're saying, Fitzwilliam? What is it you are talking of? What are you telling Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is." She just wants to know everything, right? "We are speaking of music, madam," said he, when no longer able to avoid a reply. "Of music, then pray speak aloud. It is of all subjects my delight. I must have my share in the conversation. If you are speaking of music, there are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I had ever learned, I should have been a great proficient, and so would Anne, if her health had allowed her to apply. I am confident that she would have performed delightfully. How does Georgiana get on, Darcy?" So, Lady Catherine doesn't know how to play the pianoforte? I thought that was like, for accomplished girls, and neither does her daughter, because she's been sick, apparently. So she's asking about Georgiana, which is Darcy's sister. Mr. Darcy spoke with affectionate praise of his sister's proficiency. "I am very glad to hear such a good account of her," said Lady Catherine, "and pray tell her from me that she cannot expect to excel if she does not practice a great deal." "I assure you, madam," he replied, "that she does not need such advice. She practices very constantly." "So much the better. It cannot be done too much, and when I next write her, I shall charge her not to neglect it on any account. I often tell young ladies that no excellence in music is to be acquired without constant practice. I have told Miss Bennet several times that she will never play really well unless she practices more, and though Mrs. Collins has no instrument, she is very welcome, as I have often told her, to come to Rosings every day and play on the pianoforte in Mrs. Jenkinson's room. She would be in nobody's way, in that part of the house." How rude of her, saying that, Charlotte's welcome to go to Rosings and practice on, the pianoforte there because, Charlotte doesn't have one at her house, but that she should go to Miss Jenkinson's room because she'd be out of the way. I mean, Darcy looked a little ashamed of his aunt's ill breeding and made no answer. Ooh, so even Darcy was like, dude, my aunt's kind of being mean. When coffee was over, Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Elizabeth of having promised to play to him, and she sat down directly to the instrument. He drew a chair near her. Lady Catherine listened to half a song and then talked, as before, to her other nephew till the latter walked away from her and, moving with his usual deliberation towards the pianoforte, stationed himself so as to command a full view of the fair performer's countenance. So he went to the pianoforte to go listen, talking about Darcy, but he actually put himself in the view of Elizabeth's face. He wanted to see her full face, not just listen to her song. Elizabeth saw what he was doing, and at the first convenient pause turned to him with an arch smile and said, "You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all this state to hear me, but I will not be alarmed, though your sister does play so well. There is a stubbornness about me that can never bear to be frightened at the will of others. My courage always rises with every attempt to intimidate me." "I shall not say that you are mistaken," he replied, "because you could not really believe me to entertain any design of alarming you, and I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance long enough to know that you find great enjoyment in occasionally professing opinions which in fact are not your own." Elizabeth laughed heartily at this picture of herself and said to Colonel Fitzwilliam, "Your cousin will give you a very pretty notion of me and teach you not to believe a word I say. I am particularly unlucky in meeting with a person so well able to expose my real character in a part of the world where I had hoped to pass myself off with some degree of credit. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, it is very ungenerous in you to mention all that you knew to my disadvantage in Hertfordshire." So she's like, "How dare you mention my bad qualities?" And they're being funny, they're teasing each other, And so she's like, "Oh, you just mention all my bad qualities and not my good ones, And give me leave to say, very impolitic too, for it is provoking me to retaliate. And such things may come out as will shock your relations to hear." She's like, "Oh, so you're teasing me. Well, I'm going to tease you back. Be careful, because then I'm going to say something you're not going to want people to hear." "I am not afraid of you," he said smilingly. Pray let me hear what you have to accuse him of," cried Colonel Fitzwilliam. "I should like to know how he behaves among strangers." So they're teasing each other, and now Colonel Fitzwilliam is like, "Hey, I want to know more about my cousin. Do tell." "You shall hear then, but prepare yourself for something very dreadful. The first time of my ever seeing him in Hertfordshire, you must know, was at a ball. And at this ball, what do you think he did? He danced only 4 dances. I am sorry to pain you, but so it was. He danced only 4 dances, though gentlemen were scarce. And to my certain knowledge, more than one young lady was sitting down in want of a partner. Mr. Darcy, you cannot deny the fact." So she's retelling about that very first time that she met him at the assembly at the beginning of the book, and how he didn't dance with anybody, and everybody was like, "Oh, he's so disagreeable." And she's just retelling the story, "I had not at that time the honor of knowing any lady in the assembly beyond my own party." So Darcy's like, "Well, I didn't know anybody there. Like, how am I going to dance with people I don't know?" "True, and nobody can ever be introduced in a ballroom. Well, Colonel Fitzwilliam, what do I play next? My fingers await your orders." "Perhaps," said Darcy, "I should have judged better had I sought an introduction, but I am ill qualified to recommend myself to strangers." He's like, "Well, maybe I should have introduced myself to people." He's like, "But I don't do it very well. I just don't introduce myself to people. That's just not what I do." "Shall we ask your cousin the reason of this?" said Elizabeth, still addressing Colonel Fitzwilliam. "Shall we ask him why a man of sense and education, and who has lived in the world, is ill qualified to recommend himself to strangers?" She's like, "Well, why not? What's wrong? Why can't you introduce yourself? What's the problem? You're qualified. I mean, you're educated. You basically like you have rank. You can do it." "I can answer your question," said Fitzwilliam, without applying to him. "It is because he will not give himself the trouble." There you go. Fitzwilliam probably told the truth. He's like, he just doesn't want to bother with it. I certainly have not the talent which some people possess, said Darcy, of conversing easily with those I have never seen before. I cannot catch their tone of conversation, or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done. He's like, I don't know how to do it. He's like, I'm not that great at talking with people or pretending to be interested in what they're talking about. He's like, when I'm not, that's just not me. My fingers, said Elizabeth, do not move over this instrument in the masterly manner which I see so many women's do. They have not the same force or rapidity, and do not produce the same expression. But then I have always supposed it to be my own fault, because I would not take the trouble of practicing. It is not that I do not believe my fingers as capable as any other woman's of superior execution. So Elizabeth is comparing his lack of ability to introduce himself to people or to talk to people, you know, and she compares it to the way she doesn't play the pianoforte very well. It's because she hasn't practiced. So basically it's her fault. So she's kind of telling Darcy, like, hey, it's your fault. You should practice. You need to try this. Darcy smiled and said, you are perfectly right. You have employed your time much better. No one admitted to the privilege of hearing you can think anything wanting. We neither of us perform to strangers. Here they were interrupted by Lady Catherine, who called out to know what they were talking of. I nosy. Elizabeth immediately began playing again. Lady Catherine approached, and after listening for a few minutes, said to Darcy, Miss Bennet would not play at all amiss if she practised more and could have the advantage of a London master. She has a very good notion of fingering, though her taste is not equal to Anne's. Anne would have been a delightful performer had her health allowed her to learn. Elizabeth looked at Darcy to see how cordially he assented to his cousin's praise, but neither at that moment nor at any other could she discern any symptom of love. And from the whole of his behavior to Miss de Bourgh, she derived this comfort from Miss Bingley, that he might have been just as likely to marry her had she been his relation. Lady Catherine continued her remarks on Elizabeth's performance, mixing with them many instructions on execution and taste. Elizabeth received them with all the forbearance of civility, and at the request of the gentleman remained at the instrument till her ladyship's carriage was ready to take them all home. All right, this is Volume 2, Chapter 9 of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, or Chapter 32 if you have a book that is not divided into volumes. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning and writing to Jane, while Mrs. Collins and Maria were gone on business into the village, when she was startled by a ring at the door, the certain signal of a visitor. As she had heard no carriage, she thought it not likely to be Lady Catherine, and under that apprehension was putting away her half-finished letter that she might escape all impertinent questions, when the door opened, and to her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, entered the room. Oh, so Elizabeth is home alone, because, you know, I guess Mr. Collins is working or doing whatever he does. And Charlotte and her sister are gone away doing something else in town or in the village. And so she's home alone writing a letter to Jane, and he shows up. Oh, let's see. He seemed astonished, too, on finding her alone, and apologized for his intrusion by letting her know that he had understood all the ladies to be within. They then sat down, and when her inquiries after Rosings were made, seemed in danger of sinking into total silence. It was absolutely necessary, therefore, to think of something, and in this emergence recollected when she had seen him last in Hertfordshire, and feeling curious to know what he would say on the subject of their hasty departure, she observed, she's like, gosh, I need something to say fast. She's like, oh my gosh, oh, I know. I'll ask him this. How very suddenly you all quitted Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. It must have been a most agreeable surprise to Mr. Bingley to see you all after him so soon. For if I recollect right, he went but the day before. He and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London. Perfectly so, I thank you. So just letting you know, that's going back to when Bingley left Netherfield. He left, but I think he was going to go back. But to be sure that he wouldn't go back, Bingley and Darcy, I'm sorry, Miss Bingley and Darcy, they split too. I'm thinking they were like, hey, we're all at London. Why don't you just stay here? Kind of encouraging him to get away from Jane, I think. Well, I mean, that's a suspicion, right? So perfectly so, I thank you. She found that she was to receive no other answer, and after a short pause added, I think I have understood that Mr. Bingley has not much idea of ever returning to Netherfield again? I have never heard him say so, but it is probable that he may spend very little of his time there in future. He has many friends, and he is at a time of life when friends and engagements are continually increasing. If he means to be but little at Netherfield, it would be better for the neighborhood that he should give up the place entirely, for then we might possibly get a settled family there. But perhaps Mr. Bingley did not take the house so much for the convenience of the neighborhood as for his own, and we must expect him to keep her quitted on the same principle. I should not be surprised, said Darcy, if he were to give it up as soon as any eligible purchase offers. Elizabeth made no answer. She was afraid of talking longer of his friend, and having nothing else to say, was now determined to leave the trouble of finding a subject to him. So she's like, fine, that's it. I'm just not going to talk about this anymore. He's going to have to find a subject to talk about because I already did it. I already did it once. He took the hint and soon began with, this seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins came to Hunsford. I believe she did, and I am sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on a more grateful object. Mr. Collins appears very fortunate in his choice of a wife. Yes, indeed, his friends may well rejoice in his having met with one of the very few sensible women who would have accepted him or have made him happy if they had. My friend has an excellent understanding, though I am not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the wisest thing she ever did. She seems perfectly happy, however, and in a prudential light, it is certainly a very good match for her. Elizabeth, I mean, does she have to say that, you know? She said, I'm not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the wisest thing she ever did. I'm like, just keep that to yourself, girl. Anyway. It must be very agreeable to her to be settled within so easy a distance of her own family and friends. An easy distance, do you call it? It's nearly 50 miles. So he's saying, oh yeah, well that's cool that she lives like a short distance away from her actual family. And Elizabeth is like, that's 50 miles. That's a long way. And what is 50 miles of good road? Little more than half a day's journey. Yes, I call it a very easy distance. I should never have considered the distance as one of the advantages of the match, cried Elizabeth. I should never have said Mrs. Collins was settled near her family. It is a proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. He's like, oh, well, that's because you're attached to your place where you live. That's why you feel like that. Anything beyond the very neighborhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far. As he spoke, there was a sort of smile which Elizabeth fancied she understood. He must be supposing her to be thinking of Jane and Netherfield, and she blushed as she answered, I do not mean to say that a woman may not be settled too near her family. The far and the near must be relative and depend on many varying circumstances. Where there is fortune to make the expense of traveling unimportant, distance becomes no evil. But that is not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not such a one that will allow of frequent journeys, and I am persuaded my friend would not call herself near her family unless under less than half the present distance. She's like, yeah, no. I wouldn't consider Charlotte being near her family because, I mean, it's not like she has a whole lot of money to spend on traveling. You know? Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her and said, what? He got closer? Mr. Darcy drew his chair a little towards her and said, you cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment. You cannot have been always at Longbourn. So why is he talking about her? Like, what do you mean you? And he's closer. Elizabeth looked surprised. The gentleman experienced some change of feeling. He drew back his chair, took a newspaper from the table, and glancing over it, said in a colder voice, are you pleased with Kent? So I wonder if he realized that he was becoming too familiar. He was being a little bit too friendly. when he got closer to her and started talking about, how she felt about being either close or too far, or being attached to Longbourn. And then he suddenly just picked up a newspaper and was like, he gathered himself again. A short dialogue on the subject of the country ensued on either side, calm and concise, and soon put an end to by the entrance of Charlotte and her sister, just returned from their walk. The tete-a-tete surprised them. Mr. Darcy related the mistake which had occasioned his intruding on Miss Bennet, and after sitting a few minutes longer without saying much to anybody, went away. "What can be the meaning of this?" said Charlotte, as soon as he was gone. "My dear Eliza, he must be in love with you, or he would never have called on us in this familiar way." But when Elizabeth told of his silence, it did not seem very likely, even to Charlotte's wishes, to be the case. And after various conjectures, they could at last only suppose his visit to proceed from the difficulty of finding anything to do, which was the more probable from the time of year. So she's like, "No, he doesn't love me. He's just bored. He doesn't have anything else to do, so he just stopped by." All the field sports were over. Within doors there was Lady Catherine, books, and a billiard table, but gentlemen cannot be always within doors, and in the nearness of the parsonage, or the pleasantness of the walk to it, or of the people who lived in it, the two cousins found a temptation from this period of walking thither almost every day. So the two cousins are talking about Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam. They go and visit the Collins residence every day. It's either one of them, both of them, I'm not sure. They called at various times in the morning, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and now and then accompanied by their aunt. Even Lady Catherine de Bourgh came over sometimes. It was plain to them all that Colonel Fitzwilliam came because he had pleasure in their society, a persuasion which of course recommended him still more, and Elizabeth was reminded by her own satisfaction in being with him, as well as by his evident admiration of her former favorite, George Wickham. So Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Elizabeth of George Wickham with the way he behaved, and not just that, about how he treated her. He was kind of attracted to her. And though in comparing them she saw there was less captivating softness in Colonel Fitzwilliam's manners, she believed he might have the best informed mind. But why Mr. Darcy came so often to the parsonage it was more difficult to understand. It could not be for society, as he frequently sat there 10 minutes together without opening his lips. I really think Mr. Darcy just doesn't like to talk. He likes to be around society. He likes to hang out, but he doesn't want to be like in the center of attention, And when he did speak, it seemed the effect of necessity rather than of choice, a sacrifice to propriety, not a pleasure to himself. He seldom appeared really animated. Mrs. Collins knew not what to make of him. Colonel Fitzwilliam's occasional laughing at his stupidity proved that he was generally different, which her own knowledge of him could not have told her. And as she would have liked to believe this changed the effect of love, of the object of that love, her friend Eliza, she set herself seriously to work to find it out. So Charlotte's convinced, or maybe not convinced, but she really thinks that Darcy could be in love with Elizabeth. So she's gonna keep an eye on him to try and figure things out. She watched him whenever they were at Rosings and whenever he came to Hunsford, but without much success. He certainly looked at her friend a great deal, but the expression of that look was disputable. It was an earnest, steadfast gaze, but she often doubted whether there were much admiration in it, and sometimes it seemed nothing but absence of mind. So she saw Darcy stare and just look around, and then he'd stare at Elizabeth, but it looked like he was just like there was no animation in his countenance at all. She had once or twice suggested to Elizabeth the possibility of his being partial to her, but Elizabeth always laughed at the idea, and Mrs. Collins did not think it right to press a subject from the danger of raising expectations, which might only end in disappointment. She's like, "Oh, well, I better not put that in Elizabeth's head. I don't want her to, be disappointed." Girl, you don't know your friend then. She does not like Mr. Darcy. For in her opinion, it admitted not of a doubt that all her friends' dislike would vanish if she could suppose him to be in her power. So Charlotte thinks that Elizabeth would end up liking Darcy if she knew Darcy liked her first. I don't think Elizabeth's like that. In her kind schemes for Elizabeth, she sometimes planned her marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam. She's just saying that she imagines Elizabeth marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam, not that she's actually planning it. He was, beyond comparison, the pleasantest man. He certainly admired her, and his situation in life was most eligible. But to counterbalance these advantages, Mr. Darcy had considerable patronage in the church, and his cousin could have none at all.